Welcome, everyone. One of the themes of this conference is bringing together all different types of stakeholders in the longevity research field, and this includes governmental institutions as well. Thus, I'm very glad to now be able to interview Dr. Ronald Kohanski, Deputy Director of the Division of Aging Biology at the National Institute on Aging of the NIH and co-founder of the Trans NIH Geroscience Interest Group. As you might remember, Ron gave a keynote at our physical conference last year, and I'm looking forward to this discussion very much. Welcome, Ron.
Thank you, Keith. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk to you again. The more frequent our interactions, the better off I am.
I like that very much. And I guess, before we dive into the meat of it, I guess pulse check, how's everything going in the era of COVID with you?
Things are going okay. I've been at home since March 5th.
For quite a while.
Soon as I found out that Starbucks wouldn't let me use my own cup, I came home.
Yeah, I ran away to Long Island myself from the city with my parents, and that's thankfully
Yeah.
going well. But I guess with that, we can dive into the questions in earnest. First one is a softball. Most people in our community are likely familiar with the existence of the NIA, but might not be clear exactly on how it operates or how it relates to the broader NIH. Can you give a quick overview of what the role the NIA plays?
I can do both. The mission of the NIH is turning discovery into health. And the mission of the NIA is to turn discoveries about aging into health for people at older ages. There are roughly 50 million people over the age of 65 in the US right now, and the numbers worldwide and in the US are expected to increase. So we support research as a government agency. That's what we do. We support research. Congress appropriates some money for us, and then we distribute it for two programs. One is the intramural research program run by Luigi Ferrucci, which covers, again, the same range of things that are covered in the other side, the extramural research program. We have 4 scientific divisions and several offices. The 4 scientific divisions are basic biology, where I am, and there's clinical geriatrics and clinical gerontology, which is more on the clinical trials side of things. And there's Division of Neuroscience, which has the mandate for Alzheimer's disease. NIA is the lead institute at NIH on Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. Not the sole institute, but the lead. And then there's the Division of Behavioral and Social Research, which covers basically what it says in the names, epidemiological studies. They have the health and retirement study. We also have an Office of Special Populations, which focuses on research and support of improved health in health disparity populations, as they are called, minorities, disadvantaged populations, et cetera. And we have an Office of Small Business Research run by Todd Hain, who is actively promoting research funding in the biotech space. The Office of Special Populations was run by Carl Hill, I should add, but is now run by Patricia Jones. Carl left to join an Alzheimer's disease organization.
Gotcha. So that leads me to 2 follow-up questions. One of which I hear a lot is, obviously you mentioned some specific age-related diseases in your response there, like Alzheimer's disease.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that obviously our whole field is trying to advocate for is more funding directly to the root causes of aging itself, and maybe not necessarily end-stage pathologies. Is the money still being siloed into end-stage research, or is it really going to the root causes? So I'm not sure if you can get into specifics or broad.
Well, let me speak broadly to it. So in the credo of turning discovery into health is you have to make the discovery. So the breakdowns are some money going to basic research, probably the majority of it, and some money going into translational research and some money going into clinical studies and clinical trials. So we do not hesitate to turn, as an organization, we don't hesitate to turn these discoveries around from the laboratory and the bench to clinical studies and clinical trials where possible, where feasible, and where it can be done safely and ethically.
Gotcha. Now, on that subject, how does the NIA calculate the cost effectiveness of potential projects to support? How do you weigh them against each other in terms of this mission?
So weighing one project against another is done at the program level. Evaluating whether the science looks like it's a good idea is done by peer review. That's done at all the scientific funding organizations, to my knowledge, whether they're governmental or private. So the peer review process is about a 9-month time lag between the time an application is submitted until the time funding is released. With the current COVID-19 emergency situation, as with SARS, as with MERS, and based on what we had learned in dealing with the HIV epidemic, we have emergency situations where we can expedite the process of review and award. So how do we measure success? You can measure it in lots of ways, but there are two principal outcomes that you can measure. One is, have you advanced knowledge, and have you advanced to having drugs in the marketplace? So you need both, and so there's a cyclic effect, because as things get out into the marketplace, you then monitor how it's going. And that's where NIA has a special interest, because we're looking at long-term effects of things. So where you have treatments anywhere in the life course, from infancy on, we are looking also at long-term effects. So along with other institutes, National Cancer Institute has a whole program, I believe run by Paige Green, where they follow up children who had cancer and were treated, and they have accelerated aging. So we have a shared interest there with the National Cancer Institute on rate of aging. And we had done that through some collaborations with Arthi Huria, the late Arthi. She has set up Institute on Aging and Cancer at City of Hope. It's the only one in the country, to my knowledge. So a measure of success there is, can we ameliorate the accelerated aging of these childhood cancer survivors? And in order to do that, we have to understand what aging is and how it is manifest. And so if we have success in that arena, it's because they show fewer symptoms of age as they are progressing. The same is true for HIV patients. They show accelerated aging. And can we do something to help slow the rate of aging for these people? You can go from numbers of publications, numbers of Nobel Prizes or other prizes. Those are metrics of success. Ultimately, the metric of success is, have you helped people?
Makes sense. Now, on that subject of evaluation, I believe you had spoke last year at our physical conference about trying to develop sort of an aggregate metric for resilience that would be similar in some ways to other scales like the fetal development scales, the Ballard, Apgar, Tanner scales, right, etc. Has there been progress in that regard? Has there been anything put into effect as far as evaluating efficacy over long term with these types of scales?
So there are a number of scales for resilience, and they have different utility. There's one developed by a Canadian group, Mitnitsky, I believe, is the principal mover in that, working with some physicists, actually, and some computer guys. You know how that goes. And so they have a high...
Is this like thermodynamics of aging or something?
No. It's not thermodynamics. Thermodynamics is usually an equilibrium situation, and life at its best is a steady state, and you know the difference. So we're open-ended energy system. We're not a closed box, kinetic theory of gas, all that stuff. That's not us. So, but they have an aggregate that's some biological metrics and some performance metrics and some health metrics. And you bring all of that together, and it's a pretty good predictive metric because they took a systems level approach. So other people, Snyder out at Stanford, he's chair of genetics, I think, has something that he published this last year. Lahalier was the lead author. And that's a set of metrics taken over a relatively short period of time where you can intuit, I guess you would say, the rate of aging of individuals there. So it's not exactly a frailty index, but it's an agiotype metric, which is useful. There's also some work from Dwigu Uchar at University of Connecticut on metrics of immune aging, where she shows differences between males and females, how they age. So immune aging is a kind of frailty, and better immune aging is a kind of resilience. So there's a lot that's being done, and a lot of it is being driven by an understanding that biology is about heterogeneity, really. You can take the 300 plus million people in this country, even identical twins, we're all different. And so we are heterogeneous, even though we're all the same, we're all people. So there's now greater technology behind understanding heterogeneity. And I think that's driving things like resilience, things like frailty, but also our understanding of the basic biology. So a lot was done. I mean, Nitsky's work goes back decades. And it's their use of the systems level approaches maybe in the last decade or half decade. And I think that's a big advance. Others are doing the same thing. Lots of frailty indices that are useful clinically, meaning if you have a person of such and such an age with these comorbidities and these various conditions, can you assess the likelihood they would survive surgery?
Mm.
Near Barzilai tells the story of a 102-year-old woman who broke her ankle. And the doctor said, get in a wheelchair. And the woman said, I want surgery so I can get up and move around. She was right. So, you know, you have the sort of indifferent matrices, and then you have the person. You always have to deal with the person to the extent possible in clinical practice. So I would say the short answer is yes. There's been a lot of advances in frailty. They predated my comments on it, but the advances continue quite rapidly, almost exponential, maybe geometric, somewhere in there.
Got to set the appropriate level of hype on that. No,
Yes.
but that's very exciting. So in that response, you were obviously talking about ways of different measurements, and this crosses over into the subject of biomarkers, and that leads me to a question of, I'm actually, a little bit surprised at myself that I didn't know that the NIH had sort of a healthcare commons data aggregation system called the All of Us initiative, which I only recently discovered. And as I talk to more and more people in the field, that seems to be a shared experience of like, oh, I wasn't quite sure that this was happening. So given that it has been running, I think, for over a year, can you speak to how the NIA interacts with that broader initiative, and particularly if there's any ability to track, biomarkers of aging as part of what they're doing, or if not, are there plans to add it more? Because I think that would be very interesting to a lot of our audience.
I can't speak to that with as much information as I would like. But I can say that in the collection of clinical metrics, there are a number of cytokines and other inflammatory markers that are part of a standard clinical workup that use can be made of in terms of aging. Right now, there are about, I think, 350 million people. There's 335,000 people engaged with the target of 1 million with the electronic health records, et cetera. So that's, as you pointed out, it's a nascent work in progress. NIA takes pretty much the same interest as any other NIH institute in that. We have epidemiologists who are supported by NIA. We also have intramural epidemiologists who would be digging into the data and looking for how the age factor plays out in any of it.
Right, yeah. The reason why I ask is obviously over the past few years, a lot of talks that happened at our conference and elsewhere have been very interested in sort of having aging become a secondary indication for pretty much every kind of trial, right, since it's always happening. So I think that that's an area where if we can really standardize biomarkers and make them part of systems like All of Us, that could create exciting opportunities. So
right, the biomarkers is a work in progress as well. We've been 35 years trying to develop biomarkers of aging, and I think one of the issues with biomarkers of biology of aging is that the biology that takes place during aging is the same biology that took place during most of life. Maybe not all of life, but certainly most of life. And it's where the biological system begins to malfunction or has moved away from what would be an optimal steady state. And there's so many such systems, how they integrate, how they interact, how they impinge on one another is something of a problem. So a biomarker of let's say, inflammation might represent long-term, low-level inflammation that doesn't by itself trigger something except for the duration of the low-level inflammation. versus an acute inflammatory response. You have largely the same set of molecules engaged in that. So if you collect a marker in a clinical study, you need to know when was the last infection, what was the course of treatment, what other things are going on, what's the pro-inflammatory state, obesity, some other chronic illness. So there's a lot of things that go into what they would be. I think the epidemiologists call these confounds, which simply enough is you can't make a straightforward interpretation from a pile of numbers. We're definitely working on it.
Gotcha.
Trying to see what they would be.
Now, aside from that sort of obfuscation that you just mentioned, do you see any other sort of systemic issues that have been getting in the way of getting good biomarkers? You know my thoughts on this coming from the IT background.
Right. I think that there are no barriers. I think that the barriers that were there are the same barriers that science has experienced since Aristotle, perhaps, and that is what's the technology? And the technology has really exploded. Artificial intelligence, you're more familiar with that than I am, but I think that artificial intelligence has promise, and along with every promise, of course, there's some dangers. You still have to have human intelligence somewhere in the play. But as far as picking up if you wanted to look for a needle in a haystack, artificial intelligence would be a good way to go. And one of the things that's happened now is with the omics technology, the haystack got bigger. We don't know if there are any more needles in it to pick out. That's the thing. So finding the patterns that are aging related in what is a fundamentally heterogeneous process is a little bit difficult. That's why having multiple markers and a network like the other scores that I had mentioned in my talk and to which you alluded, as an aggregate can give you information. And that's really what Magnitsky did with the frailty index. He has an aggregate. He has a way of giving you what most people like. I want one number. How am I doing, doc? You know, on a scale of 1 to 10, how am I doing? That's not that easy to do. It's like, how are you doing yesterday? How are you doing today? And how do you think you'll do tomorrow? Right? To paraphrase Ronald Reagan's 1980 debate with Jimmy Carter, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Right? Or 10 years ago, or 20 years ago? Well, 20 years ago, no, you're not better off. You're wiser, but you're 20 years older.
Yeah, well, I don't think they were thinking about it in terms of, biological progress, when he asked that question, but totally fair point, but we should. So I think that's actually a very natural segue to almost like a question about strategy here. So obviously all of us here are looking to how we can increase the pace of this research, whatever that means, more governmental funding, more private investment, and we tend to think that raising public engagement and being informed in this and building up a grassroots movement will help. So to that point, my personal view is that while they might not give you enough information that we're looking for, I think physiological biomarkers, because a lot of them can be collected on your phone and are starting to work their way into things that people are ambiently doing, can be a nice almost sort of Trojan horse. If we can tap that into the All of Us initiative in the right way, or make people get some sort of actionable biomarker data based on that, that could be a good segue to get people into the system and get people interested in aging. Do you think that's a worthy tactic that we should try to focus on and play up, or you think there's other tactics that would be better? Just your personal perspective.
So I think it's, I'm a government official. I don't have a personal perspective. So the short answer is yes, it's worthwhile. There are, of course, cautions involved in terms of ownership of data, ownership of access to the data, where it can be used, where it can be misused. These are all societal issues. From the point of view of the research, collecting data in a rational way is a good idea. So you have to have some idea of how you're going to integrate the data and then interpolate things that are missing in the data. And then it's an iterative process. Of course, you get some information, you see how it works out. One of the issues vis-a-vis aging is as you collect data and as you look at responses to different things, so somebody starts exercising or taking metformin or some other drug, or doing whatever it is, napping in the afternoon, I don't know, changing their times of sleep, changing the diet patterns. There's all sorts of things you can do. So how do you measure what's going on in terms of your health? And you can say, well, I feel better. A guy I knew at Johns Hopkins who ran the microscopy department had a pretty bad diet. And he switched over to a carbohydrate-free diet, died 2 months later of a heart attack. Oof. He felt great for those 2 months, but it's you had a lifetime of bad behavior. Now you're trying to correct that. Your expectations have to be adjusted. So you might feel great, but in fact, you still need those clinical evaluations. So what I mean by this is, it's good to collect data that's accessible through portable devices, but you still need to have the interaction with the physician. So to the extent I have a personal viewpoint, that would be my viewpoint. And on a personal note, my physician, my primary care, just retired at the age of 88. I think he's 88. Graduated Cornell 21 years before me. So that would be approximately 88. So sharp as anything, great diagnostician. But still, you have to have that combination of things. So how long does it take to determine if something is effective when it comes to aging? So do you have to wait 20 years? And then is it specific to each cohort? And is it specific to each environmental situation or each living situation? So I think one of the things from Snyder's study and from other studies is that 2 or 3 years is enough to tell you, but 2 or 3 months is probably too short. So one of the things about aging, right, you acquire patience with age, right, supposedly. So you have to be patient when it comes to improving one's health as a matter of age. My daughter-in-law had one of these Fitbit things, and it was monitoring all sorts of stuff about what she was doing during breastfeeding. And I quipped that this monitoring device does everything except relieve an obsessive need to monitor your behavior and data on a regular basis. So if your time frame is a couple of years and you're getting information in days and minutes, that can produce some anxiety, which we know from social and behavioral research is bad for your health. Mm. So
that's my problem.
You have to have a way of dealing with this flood of information in a way that's beneficial. But I am in favor of it.
Absolutely, and I do agree that I think, although you can overstate it, I do think machine learning, AI will hopefully, at least partially, come to the rescue there. But
yeah, it's not a cure-all.
Yeah, but something in your answer made me think of a different topic. So you mentioned your primary care physician retiring at 88. Does the NIA strictly deal with research or the other aspects? For example, with the concept of longer lives, there's always the idea of re-engaging the elderly, retraining for second careers, those sort of ideas. And also, like access, right? Take Nir Barzilai's, Tame study as an example, or the longevity dividend, these charts that show the charts that will show what the societal benefit will be if we can, realize the benefits of the Tame trial. There's always like a tacit assumption there that the public actually gets the therapy, right? So there's a question there of access. Does the NIA play any roles in like helping initiatives to improve access to the therapies that are there and that sort of thing?
So I don't know that we have an official program on access. I think that's more of a policy issue. Mm-hmm. We have offices that deal with advocacy. So if you want to know what we can advocate, I can put you in touch with them.
Gotcha. Okay, let me pivot this to a question that you are more likely to be able to answer then.
Okay.
So you had spoke earlier about research grants, but also dealing with companies and such. Can you speak of the different ways, different elements of the field can interact? So obviously there's grants for researchers, right? But I remember some particular state level initiatives that had interesting ways, like the state would issue a grant, but only if a private company was investing to a certain level and then would match it and that sort of thing to try to grease the wheels of the whole industry. Are there aspects like that beyond just granting? What's the pantheon of ways people can benefit from dealing with the NIA?
We have some public-private partnerships, but money that comes into the NIH is always subject to NIH rules and NIH granting processes and rules and peer review, follow-up, ethical standards, whether it's laboratory animals or humans, or wild animals for that matter. So there are such partnerships. They go through the foundation for the NIH by and large. We've done some international partnerships as well. But again, it's NIH rules that apply. Gotcha. So we are aware that for small businesses to have an NIH grant is something of an imprimatur because you've gone through the peer review process. And so people think that the peers think this is an interesting idea and the NIH thinks it's worthwhile. And that can attract some money as well. In the Tame Trial, the NIH is not supporting the Tame Trial, and that's a private money activity. We may or may not have a part to play in that, but that is the Tame Trial itself is out of our hands. Very interesting trial, goes directly to the geroscience hypothesis, but there are other ideas out there besides the metformin idea, and they're based on geroscience work. So geroscience ideas gain some traction here at NIA as well. And as you know, there are all the various hallmarks of aging, telomere length, DNA damage, cellular senescence, proteostasis, all those things. They all play into requests that we get. They are attractive to us as a funding organization. But again, it's the grants process.
Gotcha.
That's what we do.
Makes sense. So
my mother used to say that I went to the NIH just so I could get her into one of these trials. I never did. They wouldn't want her anyway.
It's funny. I was just talking recently with someone who was producing a film about the fruition of this research, and it has to do with clinical trials. And they were asking a lot of these questions, like, is it okay for someone to get a family member in a trial? So this just came up in a conversation. So
yeah, on the trials, the engagement of underrepresented groups, right? The standard has been the middle-aged white male. That, in my view, that's a carryover from Greek mythology, where the standard of humanity was the 33-year-old white male Adonis-like character. I mean, you don't hear about the old age of Hercules, right? You hear about Hercules' whatever it was, 12 labors.
Yeah, the labors.
So there's an understanding at the NIH that trials have to involve people from various backgrounds, various ethnic groups, and various age ranges, where appropriate. So if you're testing something for a childhood disease, you're not going to involve adults. But if you're doing something for adults and you don't involve older people, then you don't know how it applies to older people.
Right.
But older people have more morbidities, so they're at greater risk. So then you have the ethical considerations that are involved in exposing someone at greater risk. And there are all the issues of what is informed consent, what is informed. And these are very difficult questions. How to ask a question in a clinical trial is a science in itself.
Makes sense. And that's one of the reasons why I'm optimistic for the future with things like All of Us and the ability to essentially structure what you could consider kind of crowdsourced clinical trials, because I think when you can do that, you can involve a lot more people earlier in the process, and in a sense, sort of comply with medical ethics more, right? And give more people, if you can help instead of just looking at 20 people in a double-blind scenario and wringing as much statistical power as you can out of them because there's so few. But if you can find a way to have a massive cohort, you maybe can actually provide help just in different doses or whatever.
Right, but one of the things that we have to ensure in clinical trials and clinical studies is anonymity. I don't know if you can pull that off from crowdsourcing.
Well, that ties to one of the earlier discussion topics, which is you mentioned international collaborations. So this will be a little bit of a narrative, but just let me go with it. So there's obviously other countries that have been able to figure out certain ways to do anonymized data sharing, like blockchain and what Estonia is doing. But typically when I mention this to American researchers, there's a little bit of a laughing response, like, good luck having America switch over to some blockchain healthcare record system. Do you sort of share that skepticism? Do you think there's a path forward there? You know, just in general.
That's above my pay grade, as we are taught to say.
Gotcha. Well, we'll work on it on the tech side.
But
We'll see
I
what we
mean,
can
my
do.
first reaction to that is most people hear that probably have to look for Estonia on the map.
Fair, but I do think there are models out there that can show
Right.
how we could do it. So whether we can
Well,
get there or not,
we have
so
a tendency to favor working with countries of origin, as you might say. So we were English colonies, work with the United Kingdom health records. They have the ELSA study, things
mm,
like that. They're enormous. We're skeptical of the French for reasons I can't quite grasp. Maybe it's a language barrier. But ancestrally, we have had long interactions with the French, both favorable and unfavorable on political grounds. We are also able to use studies or be interested in studies anyway in countries that have relatively genetically homogeneous populations, like Iceland. I think comes from a small set of founding females, and the Netherlands, which
mm,
is very good on studies uh, at the population level. Um, there may be reasons as to why those countries manage the studies that they do in the way that they do, um, and I don't know to what extent those translate over to studies that would be done in the United States. But the information certainly is exchangeable. People in the Division of Behavioral and Social Research have gone to great lengths to understand how to harmonize questionnaires, or what they call it, study instruments, among different populations. So again, going back to the issue of how you do a trial, or how do you gather data on people's behaviors, the same words has different meanings in different cultures. So when we go to cultures where we are less familiar, less European, in other words, then those are barriers. But our investigators and our staff in DBSR have learned how to deal with those. Those apply to minority populations in this country from Asian and of African origin.
yeah. One note I was just going to say on that is on the question of data sharing. One thing that I would like, everyone, our audience, anyone who works in the field, is to definitely take a look at some of the standards that are emerging for the how to represent, electronic healthcare records. Because don't get me wrong, software and biology are different things, and there's always going to be things that you're using different Q-tips than you're using whatever, right?
Yeah,
But we can at least try to at least get the data to be standardized, so we can reduce one level of complexity. But we'll see.
right, right.
So, one very timely question that I have is because of COVID-19 and the upregulation, so to speak, of the societal awareness of things like immunosenescence and how it would be helpful to reverse that. Are there any sort of changes that are happening in the NIA or the NIH in terms of funding opportunities, in terms of trying to look at, very similar to metformin, like looking at things that are already safe that may have a good immune system effect, and let's retrial them again for that indication because it's super timely right now? Anything like that changing or happening now because of the pandemic?
Short answer is yes. There's a lot of information taken from other uh, walks of scientific and clinical life, as it were, and being applied in tests and questions about COVID-19. So, as you know, there was a special appropriation from Congress for COVID-19. A lot of it went to NIAID, under $1 billion for NIAID, about 100 million to NHLBI. I don't recall the smaller amounts of money to other institutes. NIA did not get any appropriation this time. But we've had a lot of inquiries. There were a couple of notices of special interest asking for applications on an emergency basis. So we had both straightforward applications, generally speaking, are going to grant applications going to NIAID for obvious reasons. It's an infectious disease, and that's their specialty. They have awareness and interest in the aging aspect of it. There's also a focus on the basic biology of the virus, and how that works. So from the point of view of aging and geroscience, there are a lot of different aspects to it. Can you use what we know about geroscience to understand who's at greater risk? I have to speak generally now. I can't go into any specifics. We can use any of the hallmarks of aging to understand why older people, or anyone actually, would be at risk, because as you know, there are these populations with apparently accelerated aging. So these would be applicable. Can you take anything that you know about altering the biology of aging and apply that in treatments or therapies for the COVID-19 infections? So that would be severity of the disease, and then there are other things such as the outcomes. So you have people who come in to the hospital with mild symptoms to as severe as death, or spending a month or a month and a half or 2 months on a ventilator. Any of those things from mild to you can live through it, but you're worse off afterwards. Those go back to resilience and frailty, and they also have to do, generally speaking, hallmarks. So can you, in a quick test, determine who's at greater risk? Not just taking their age, but their biology of age, their biological age, as it's called, and see if that's a factor. Can you take anything that you know about the biology of aging and come to an understanding of why the virus spreads to other tissues? And even if the virus itself is not in other tissues, the cytokine storm that's mentioned frequently, how that affects other tissues, and how that happens as a function of age.
Right, that makes sense. So now, given that reprioritization of how we're thinking about things, does that make its way down to different granting opportunities being available that are specifically tailored to this intersection with COVID, or it's sort of the same granting opportunities, but you need to know how to look for the right ones that are related?
So there's some notices, funding opportunity announcements that went out.
Great.
Requesting applications. There's one called RADx, which has to do with diagnostics. So improving ways of understanding who's got the infection, who doesn't. There's antibody testing, which also falls into the all of us category, because that's information that would go in there. Although the all of us in-person exams have been, I don't know if they've been halted, but I'm pretty sure there's less of them as a consequence of the COVID-19, because you don't want to try to do something for someone's health, but put them at greater risk. So that, I think, is on hold for a while.
Gotcha.
But the funding opportunities are out there. There's social, behavioral, and economic outcomes. There was some funding opportunities for that.
That partially answers one of my earlier questions. So there is some aspect of the broader consequences, not just biological, in addressing it.
Yes, absolutely. One thing that I think, generally speaking, is missing, and this is not a policy question. This is a biology question from my point of view, and that is the living environment. Not quite the NIAHS, National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences view, but the architectural view, that how buildings and cities are structured to take account of various needs of different segments of the population could be a part of biological research.
Interesting. Yeah, I remember I encountered someone a few years ago that was working on an application that was measuring like walkability indexes of different cities, like particularly for this sort of reason. Yeah. This is a whole other topic that I don't think we have time to get into, but what's also interesting is obviously when you're dealing with biology, which affects everything, there's all these like knock-on circular effects, right? So let's say, for example, the Tame Trial, right? The benefits that were, apparently seen. Was it all just because of biology, or was it because it made you a little bit biologically better, which then made you more likely to be active, which then had knock-on effects, right? So you can see how this can get very complicated to tease out which component is exactly truly responsible for what. So.
Right. But there's also this whole thing called the Motorpack Common Fund program, which has to do with trying to understand what are the actual biological mechanistic effects of exercise.
Interesting. All right, I'll have to delve into that some more. Okay, so we're coming up near the end of our time. So one question I like to ask in cases like this, is there any question that you wish I asked you that you really want people to know that I haven't asked you?
Ah, I will get back to you.
Diplomatic answer. Okay, let me give you a good a softball one to end with, right? So,
Okay.
because I'm going to quote something that you said. So, I believe last year at the conference you said the mission of the NIH is to make people healthier at any age, and the mission of the NIA is to make people healthier at older ages. So, my question to you is, do you personally see that as a true distinction? And if not, what roadblocks are there to have the NIH more broadly focus on aging as a means of making people of all ages healthier?
Right. So it, it's we are just one component of the NIH. So of the 27 institutes and centers, we cover everything. Um, that is a biological process, either going well or gone wrong. I think it's a distinction that's useful in terms of how you set priorities in spending the money. Is it a distinction with a difference or a difference without a distinction? I don't even remember which way it goes. But I would say that it's advantageous because it lets us set priorities. So the question becomes, when in the life course do you intervene to have people healthier at older ages? And that may be a part of the question that you're asking. And the answer is we don't quite know, but we suspect that if you have a better off childhood, you'll have a better off older age. But you can look at any centenarian right now. It's 2020, so they were born just after the First World War, went through the Second World War, may have gone through other wars and other awful things during their childhood and young adulthood, but they're 100 and over. So it's hard to say. But I think that what the view that's emerging now about being healthier at older ages means that you have to try to be healthier across the life course.
Gotcha.
But we have generally speaking tried to pick up questions of biology and questions of health from post-reproductive maturity to death. That's kind of the period we've generally covered. Should we be looking earlier? There are people who think we should. There are people who think we should start a little later. Hard to tell. Again, it's one of those iterative things.
Yeah. Would you say that generally over the past 10 years or so that the vibe is changing, that, aging is something addressable and it's something that should be looked at?
Oh, absolutely.
So
yes.
It's good. People need to hear that, even though it might sound obvious.
Yes. Aging is biology, and all biology can be adjusted.
No argument here. So if there was something that the public could do that could help give the NIA more leverage, more power, is it just rabble-rousing about this issue in general? Is there anything more targeted? How can the world help you help us, basically?
Be interested in science.
It's a good answer. So get directly in the trenches.
You don't have to get in the trenches. You can do what Alan Alda does, right? He's a famous guy, of course, but he's interested in science. So I think being educated about not just about science, but about society and the context in which science takes place. It's not in a vacuum.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think one thing, especially now in the era of COVID, is if you have your eyes open, you will see a lot of opportunities of how what we're trying to do marries nicely with a lot of other things that people care about and ways that we can educate people. So obviously that's something hopefully we can work with the NIA on directly in the future, but that's something I'm optimistic on. I've seen a big change in the past couple of years for people really starting to think that this is possible and seeing the value of it.
Yes. So, and I agree with you. I too am encouraged.
All right. Well, this was a great conversation. Thank you for this excellent discussion and taking the time to join us once again for the Ending Age-Related Diseases Conference. I hope you stay healthy and safe. That goes for everyone. And I hope we get to speak again soon, Ron.
Looking forward to it. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And you and everyone, please stay safe and healthy.